President Trump's 9-day journey is starting to head towards the close.
This was a very significant trip, not so much for the actual events of the trip, but for the choices.
You see the reception when he came off of Air Force One, Saudi Arabia, and everybody was there to meet him. What he did in Israel, I thought, was incredibly moving. Then to meet with the Pope, I really had the full trifecta, but to meet with the Pope, I thought it was a beautiful trip, and I couldn't be more proud of him.
President Trump's son-in-law is willing to cooperate, we're told, as the FBI is reportedly looking into his meetings with Russian officials.
Kushner's lawyer said he has not been contacted by federal investigators.
Well, what you see here is the politicization of the FBI. There's no objectivity here.
I'm not sure that there's much of a story here other than it's a distraction from everything else that is going on.
You may have heard that things didn't exactly go the way I planned. But you know what? I'm doing okay. I won't lie, Chardonnay helped a little too. We were curious about the past presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice.
And the fact that she brings up impeachment is kind of ironic since her husband was impeached for perjury.
I think she needs to spend more time in the woods because clearly she hasn't moved past the election. She hasn't moved past losing.
That we're all American, in God we trust. Just living the dream and never giving up.
Happy Memorial Day weekend. We are starting it off right. Look at that. Steaks, some burgers.
I'd love to hear from our viewers this morning. Are you up at 6 a.m. on Memorial Day weekend? You're off work. You get to kick back and relax.
I didn't know those grills were already fired up, or I would have already been out in the plaza eating. I mean,
I'm shocked
Memorial Day
you're here.
weekend, what better way to start it than grilling? And then we've got a Navy SEAL obstacle course.
Oh, we're going to be on, yeah, and we're going to be watching you guys do that a little bit later in the show. It'll be great. So that's a mud run obstacle course. We want also this weekend to send your Proud American photos using the Proud American hashtag. So just Proud American. And we've got a new Instagram account.
So yeah, you do at Proud American. That's apparently the Instagram account. So send it there, and then we'll show your photos throughout the
And of
show.
course, Memorial Day weekend is a sacred weekend for everybody too. You have a lot of fun with your family. You maybe grill out and hang out, but ultimately remembering those that gave everything for us.
Well, and we're going to be here all weekend long.
That's right.
We are.
Three of
Monday,
us.
right?
Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
So there's going to be a lot of meat. We're going to be eating a lot on the grill. And Pete
But then
is
we're
so
gonna work
excited.
out.
Pete is so excited because he just read a new study this morning about salt and how it's good for you.
Salt is good for you. There's a scientist somewhere, anonymously
No
sourced,
name.
Doesn't
that
matter.
says, the salt in the Daily Mail, it's got to be true, that salt is good for you. It makes you skinnier.
Well, you know
So,
what?
America, grill away,
Yeah.
put extra salt on your fries, and have, what?
What? Shout out to the peanut gallery over there.
That's right.
We got a lot of serious news, though, to get to this
That's
morning.
right. Now we start with a Fox News alert. President Trump preparing to wrap up his first overseas trip.
Yeah, the annual G7 summit in Italy is coming to a close, but he's going to address the troops before heading home.
Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live in Taormina, Italy, with more. That's the first time I've ever said Taormina.
Did he get it right?
John.
Clayton, Abby, and Pete, good morning to you. You know how much I love barbecue, but it's a hard choice between barbecue and Italian food here in Sicily. But I think I get a chance to do both this weekend, so looking forward to that. One more session in the G7 left, and then the president heads down the coast to the Sigonella Naval Air Station to talk with sailors and Navy aviators before he heads back on Air Force One to the United States. This morning, he was at the Africa outreach portion of the summit, talking with African leaders about how to further develop their economies and use the resources of the G7 to try to promote economic development in Africa. Two big headlines coming out of the summit so far in terms of the United States. First, that the president is thinking of increasing sanctions on Russia if Vladimir Putin doesn't fully implement a ceasefire in Ukraine. And then the second big headline is that the president's thinking on climate change, and the Paris Climate Accord is, quote, evolving. According to aides who are closest to him, he's had a chance to listen to G7 leaders over the last 36 hours. He's come to a broader understanding, a fuller understanding of their position and why they want to leave the Paris Agreement in place and why they think the United States should remain a part of it. Here's his chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, in an off-camera briefing yesterday. Listen to what he said.
I think his views are evolving, and he came here to learn, and he came here to get smarter. He came here to hear people's world leaders' views, some of which have been involved with the Paris Agreement for many, many years.
The president is weighing a decision on whether or not the United States should withdraw from the Paris Accord. And there's a real split in the administration. The EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, both think that it's better if the United States leaves that. Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn, on the other hand, think that it would be better for the United States to stay in. When the president returns to the United States, I mean, he might want to reconsider whether or not he goes back, because he will be arriving back to a firestorm of controversy, including these latest revelations that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, allegedly was trying to establish some sort of secure back-channel communications between the transition and Russia. So a lot for the president to digest upon his return to the United States. Abby, Clayton, Pete.
All right, John Roberts live for us. Thank you, John. Enjoy that last minute of Italian food for us.
A little bowl of bolognese. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Kushner stuff. Obviously, it's what everyone's talking about this morning. But just think about this trip, too. Wrapping up this big trip. It was the first time the president on this world stage. And by all accounts, a pretty successful trip.
Very successful trip, and being lauded on both sides of the aisle. I mean, so he goes to Saudi Arabia. We did that live on this show, the kind of greeting that he got there. Then the Western Wall, very powerful imagery, all sort of a new shift toward standing up to Iran, which is a problem from the last 8 years.
And the
Brussels
G7 summit.
Yeah,
I mean,
NATO, pay your bills.
Well,
let's focus on terrorism. It's been great.
And if you read all the meetings, you know, if you've read all the itinerary for the summit was, you know, climate change. Climate change. We want to have all these leaders talking climate change. And the president turned the conversation to Islamist terrorism and saying, look, we're here together. We have an opportunity as this community, as allies, to fight Islamist terrorism. And yes, we'll get to climate change, but that doesn't need to be the #1 thing on this agenda.
You think about how much they accomplished on this trip. As you said, I mean, we were here last weekend when it just started, when he was in Saudi Arabia. From there, obviously, going to Israel and then to Rome. And then these big meetings. I mean, we have Secretary Rumsfeld on the show. And I've heard him talk, and he said, look, I was ambassador to NATO back in the 70s. And he said, I gave the same exact message to them about our allies needing to step up. And I asked him, I said, well, did you get skewered by the media for doing that? He said, no. Because it was the right message to send then, and it's the right message to send now. I got to tell you, if I see one more headline about whether President Trump was holding Melania's hand, I am going to freak. Because there's been so much policy, so much diplomacy as part of this trip, and the headlines I have read, so many of them have been ridiculous.
Abby Huntsman, fired up.
Sorry, I can't.
No, 6 a.m. on a Saturday. That's what you get with Abby. Meanwhile, 6 a.m. on a Saturday, the President of the United States is awake and tweeting at this hour and had this to say. He said the big G7 meetings today, lots of very important matters under discussion. First on the list, of course, is terrorism. G7 Torah Mina.
That's right. He had another tweet that after that saying, many NATO countries have agreed to step up payments considerably, as they should. Money is beginning to pour in. NATO will be much stronger. I mean, this is the guy that was supposedly going to dismantle NATO.
Yeah.
I think his legacy will be making it relevant again. This is sort of an alliance that was adrift. Now, hey, if you've got focus on terrorism and radical Islamic terrorism at home and abroad, and that's what NATO does, what a fantastic transition.
Angela Merkel's take on that.
Exactly. Well, as I said, you would think that all the headlines throughout the trip would be about all of these issues that we've been talking about, mainly terrorism, but they have not been. And now as he heads home and we talk about how does he keep that momentum going when he gets back to the United States, I mean, there already is a new quote-unquote bombshell out from the Washington Post. They're trying to totally move on from this trip narrative and focus on more controversy with Russian collusion. I mean, here we go again.
More Russia. So last night at 7 p.m., an article came out of the Washington Post, and this is the headline from that article. Russian ambassador told Moscow that Jared Kushner, wanted secret channel with the Kremlin.
All right, so what does this article say? And now the New York Times is breaking it down as well, and Reuters is jumping in on this. They have other information that Jared Kushner, prior to the inauguration, was meeting with the Russian ambassador to try to set up a back channel of communication with the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin's administration somehow. Using facility, now this is the interesting part of the story, using diplomatic facilities in the United States that might be away from communications monitoring. The idea that they would sit and be able to talk and have these communications in buildings outside of the White House, outside of the American administration and government.
And the reason would be so they can't be intercepted, right?
They can't be intercepted, to have private communications with the Russian government.
There was already concern that about leaks, about monitoring at that point. This is December, so this is after the election. This is not about collusion. This is about conversations. I mean, to be very clear, a couple of tear-outs from of quotes from this Washington Post story that that I think give some good context. Of course, they're always buried deep down in the article. One of them is it's common for senior advisors of a newly elected president to be in contact with foreign leaders and officials, but new administrations are generally cautious in their handling of interactions with Moscow. So there's no wrongdoing here. There's no Jared Kushner's not the focus of the investigation, and it is common so far that they have these
and then
kind of
you wonder, as you mentioned, Clayton, about the timing, right? When this actually happened, why we're just hearing about it today. Here was another part of that piece. It says the Post was first alerted in mid-December to the meeting by an anonymous letter which said, among other things, that Kushner had talked to Kislyak about setting up the communications channel. Yet we're hearing about it now at 7 p.m. on a Friday night as the president's just heading home from the Strip. I mean, there's something going on with these like 5 p.m., 6 p.m. leaks that go out to the mainstream media that just fill the rest of the weekend.
Well, and also Bret Baier, I think, made a pretty good point about this, too. On the collusion question, I mean, this is a separate issue about setting up a back channel. But if there's the collusion question, which is still at the heart of all of this scandal, right? Why would, if they were colluding, they would set up a channel in December? Sure. After the election. Months ahead of time was the election. So Bret Baier raises an interesting question.
About the timing of all of that.
And the other question we should ask is, why should we believe it? Because Russia, as the Washington Post story says as well, makes their own fake news. It says Russia at times feeds false information into communication streams it suspects are monitored as a way of sowing misinformation and confusion amongst U.S. analysts. So we don't know who leaked this, but Russian Ambassador Kislyak has been involved in a lot of these things. Why do we have to believe, why do we believe the Russians?
And at the heart of this is the Trump Tower, too. This is where back when Michael Flynn was apparently at this meeting, was at Trump Tower with Jared Kushner and Kislyak, and where this question about monitoring Trump Tower may have arisen. And that's where the Trump administration, being the Trump administration, may have learned about this back in December, that they were intercepting communications coming out of Trump Tower with the Russians.
Yeah, well, we will see where all of this goes. But meanwhile, Hillary Clinton is back in action.
She's back.
Yeah, she spoke at Wesleyan at the commencement speech, and no surprise here, took some shots at President Trump. Take a listen.
I couldn't think of any place I'd rather be this year than right here. There is a full-fledged assault on truth and reason. Some are even denying things we see with our own eyes, like the size of crowds. When people in power invent their own facts and attack those who question them, it can mark the beginning of the end of a free society.
So that was yesterday at Wellesley. That's where she went to school as well. And so when she got political, that was really very early on in that speech. She went right there.
Absolutely. Well, that's where her mind is at. She's still, they still haven't gotten over the election. And you see it in that speech. You also see it in some articles that came out over the week in Vanity Fair. Right. It was sexism. It was this. It was that. It was everything but I was a bad candidate.
Right, and be able to reflect on yourself. I mean, it was all about James Comey. It was all about the media. It was all of these other things, except being able to connect with voters. I mean, it's pretty remarkable in that self-reflection period. But she also had some discussions about impeachment and obstruction of justice.
Sounds perfect for a commencement address.
Oh yeah, perfect. This is what you wanted kids hear. And she has a little bit of trouble with the history and the facts. Take a listen.
We were furious about the past presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice.
A lot of cheers there, but the problem was he wasn't impeached, right? He resigned before he impeached.
Actually, she was talking about President Nixon. Yeah,
right.
He resigned, was not impeached, and ironically, it was her husband who was actually impeached by that.
But as you said, Clayton, that's exactly the message you want to hear when you're going out to the real world.
Right. Oh, great! I'm going to go get a job. Thank you for that. Let us know your thoughts on that. Friends at FoxNews.com. You can weigh in on that. Absolutely. And we've got this coming up here on the show. After a successful foreign trip, how does the president keep the momentum when he comes home facing all of these problems back home? A former speechwriter for President George W. Bush has some advice for him next.
President Trump wrapping up his first overseas trip, and the Wall Street Journal reporting this morning that the president may make some staff changes and add some familiar faces to the administration upon his return. So is that what the president needs to do to keep the momentum going? Let's ask Ned Ryan. He is here to react to this. Ned, good to have you with us.
Thanks, Abby. Good to be with you.
All right, so we talked to you last weekend, and you said that's what he needs to do. He's got a clean house with a lot of people on his staff. We're hearing reports, as you saw, that may happen when he gets home. Is that the answer?
Well, so I think there's a couple things that Trump has to do, including some of those things as well. He's going to come back from the overseas trip probably with as high approval ratings as he's had, he's going to be moving from a position of strength. So there are a couple things. One, he's got to realize with his joint address and then with his speech to Saudi Arabia, he showed incredible discipline on the messaging. Come home, be disciplined on the messaging, mind your P's and Q's and tweets. So I think if he can be disciplined on some of that messaging, that's good. He's also got to bring clarity to his decision-making process. And I think the thing that's been part of the problem inside the West Wing is he has to have non-negotiable issues for the base, and then he has to have non-negotiable issues for his family members and the Democrats and say, listen, neither shall the two meet. He also has to go and say, listen, we need to flip the narrative. We need to go on the offense. Again, as I suggested last week, he can flip the narrative on this. The White House counsel can recommend to DOJ that they reopen the Hillary Clinton investigation, investigate Susan Rice and Ben Rhodes. But also, they just need to be a little bit more creative. When the word collusion comes up, he can just say, you know what? The only collusion I'm seeing right now is collusion between the media and the deep state. And then flip the Comey narrative as well. He does have to make some White House staff changes. I think he needs a new press secretary. And the last thing I would advise him, Abby, is this. If you want to see Obamacare repeal and tax reform take place, if you will be disciplined, if you will go on the offense, it will help instill some courage in these, not so, great political profiles and courage. The Hill Republicans, they need a breath of courage. He can do that. He can instill it into them. He also is going to have to put some of the weight of the presidency behind making sure these items get going.
All right, well, he's got to be exhausted. I mean, he's coming off a 9-day trip. We were here last weekend where he first started out in Saudi Arabia. A lot of people from both sides of the aisle are giving him praise, saying this was a very successful trip. What do you think?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think it was phenomenal. I mean, he started out very well in Saudi Arabia. I couldn't be more proud of what he did, standing on Saudi Arabian soil and addressing the 50 leaders of Muslim nations and speaking with real clarity, not condescending in any way, but real clarity on the real issue of extremism and how they have to be a part of the solution as well. And I loved what he was doing at NATO and addressing those leaders, saying it's time to step up. If you only have 5 of the 28 that are actually meeting the 2% of GDP, it's time for you to step up. We want to play a role, and I think this is great that he's really asserting America back on the international stage again. But at the same time, we, the taxpayers, don't want to be funding the bills for European security all by ourselves.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if that momentum continues when he gets home. Ned Ryan, good to have you with us this morning.
Thanks,
Happy Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you.
Well, President Trump called the NATO members to pay their fair share during his speech, as we've been talking about, and that made many in the media really, really upset.
President Trump lectures world leaders standing just feet away.
The theme of today's NATO summit might have been, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
So are they giving him any credit for his accomplishments? We're going to debate that coming up. And the science is in everything you have been told about salt. According to Pete Hegseth, it's all wrong. You are going to want to stick around for this news.
Back with some headlines and a Fox News alert. 2 Chinese fighter jets coming within 200 yards of a U.S. Navy surveillance plane. U.S. officials saying the jets cut off the plane in international airspace near Hong Kong. The Pentagon calling the incident unsafe and unprofessional. China has yet to respond. And the U.S. now planning its first ever test to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles. The drill is scheduled for Tuesday over the Pacific Ocean. This comes after North Korea has tested nearly a dozen missiles this year while vowing to strike the U.S. mainland. Clayton, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. Well, President Trump calling on NATO members to pay their fair share.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
But many in the liberal media saw his speech in a different light, portraying him more as a bully than a leader.
Scolding allies, a tense confrontation as President Trump lectures world leaders standing just feet away.
The theme of today's NATO summit might have been, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Instead of making nice, he scolded them.
By all accounts, just watching it, it was painful to watch.
It's one way to make an impression, scold the very people to their faces, the ones hosting you.
So much of the time, Donald's just shooting his mouth off. And he shoots his mouth off in complete and total ignorance.
There's from conservatives, too. But what's so wrong with our president defending the American people? Here to discuss former Navy SEAL Carl Higbie and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and President of the Washington Strategy Group, Joel Rubin. Nice to see both of you this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Good morning. Carl, so you heard the criticism there, not only from the left, but also some on the right, saying he seemed like he was kinder to Saudi Arabia and others than he was to our NATO allies. What do you say?
Well, I think this is something that Donald Trump campaigned on. It's like, look, we've been putting in with 3–4% of our GDP into this, and you have the bulk of the nations not paying their fair share. Why should we come to their defense? Why should we be the ones standing up and taking the world stage on this and then just getting criticized for it? It's time for other people to pony up, and I support him on these statements.
Joel, what about these numbers? Let's dive into it. Is that a fair assessment? We'll put up a map here of the United States, Greece, United Kingdom, Estonia, Poland, paying 2% of their share in this GDP. And here's a map of the folks who are not paying. He mentioned the 23 nations, including Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So are those numbers fair when the president stood up there and scolded those 23 countries?
Hi, Clayton. Good morning. There are two ways to pay. There's blood and treasure, and certainly the president is right in calling for our NATO partners to pay more. They've committed to do so by 2024, and that's an important point that every administration calls for. But they've also paid in blood. More than 1,000 NATO troops, not Americans, Americans as well, but in addition to 1,000, have died in Afghanistan, and those NATO troops died as a result of coming to America's defense after 9/11. And we have to respect that, and we have to recognize that the way to get these countries to pay more is not to criticize them in public at the leadership level, but to go to their publics and say, you need to get your leaders to pay more. These are democracies, and we have to remember that if their public doesn't support it, it's not going to work. I don't think that message made that convincing argument.
Carl, what about that point that money is one thing, blood is another?
Well, I mean, we lost 4,000 troops in this war on terror, and it's not just, we're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting globally here. And you have all these people that want to say, oh, you called them out publicly. Darn right he called them out publicly, because you know what? We've been asking them in diplomatic channels to do this for years now, and they haven't done it. So I'm glad he should be up there on the public stage calling these people out, so now the world can see this is what Trump campaigned on.
So Carl thought he was strong in calling out the world leaders on this pay
Strong
issue.
and correct.
Strong and correct. Joel, do you buy, though, that he was able to convince them to start paying more?
Now, if your goal is about getting them to pay more, this isn't going to do anything to advance that. In fact, it's going to make the publics in these countries more resistant to ponying up more money. It's not as if President Bush, who I served under as a career officer at the State Department in military affairs and Middle East affairs at the State Department again, it's not as if President Bush didn't call for this, nor President Obama. But the trick is to ensure that we're pulling them in and getting them to pay more. Right now, NATO is confused. NATO doesn't understand clearly if the United States is standing with them in Article 5 as they did with us after 9/11. And we need to make sure that we're showing them that we're with them.
Carl and Joel, have a great holiday weekend. We appreciate you joining us this morning. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Coming up here on the show, an angry mob of college snowflakes demanding a professor's resignation because he won't participate in a boycott against white people. And the college president, his boss, is siding with the students. Plus, Hillary Clinton tries to take a shot at President Trump during her commencement speech, comparing him to Richard Nixon.
Man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice.
Only problem, she didn't get the facts correct. Dan Bongino here to react to that straight ahead.
I grew up in a patriotic family, but no different than most anybody else, small town Minnesota, and we would always go to the Memorial Day Parade. You blink and you miss it, but it's one of the most powerful 5 minutes that I've ever had as a kid, and it woke me up to true patriotism. You'd have the World War II vets, and their uniforms didn't quite fit so well anymore, and the Korean vets, and the Vietnam veterans, and the Gulf War veterans who were younger and fitting into their uniforms still. And as they walked by, I will never forget the men and women of that town standing up, and there would be men saluting those who had served, and in true gratitude for what they had given. Every town in America is like Wanamingo, Minnesota. It all comes back to the families and the faith and the communities that we serve for. Because in America, you don't fight because you hate what's in front of you. You fight because you love what's behind you.
Share your pride on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
some of your proud American photos that we've been asking you to send in all morning long. This is Fran sending us this picture of himself with his patriotic car, which he'll be proudly displaying in the Brooklyn Memorial Day Parade on Monday. That is a good-looking car.
What is that, a Lincoln? Cool. What is that? I like it. I don't know, but it's cool. And this is Darren sends us this picture of his son, Mark, a midshipman in the United States Merchant Marine Academy.
And Greg sent us this picture of his front yard display where he has laid 5,000 flags and 300 crosses this year for Memorial Day.
Wow, that is above and beyond for sure. So keep sending in your photos on this Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, @Proud American. It's our new Instagram account, so send it there. Or just send it to us, friends at Fox News. We'll make sure that we're straight to Clayton's email.
You know, I got my secretarial handled for you. Meanwhile, speaking of Proud Americans, Dan Bongino, former Secret Service agent, former NYPD officer, and a host of the podcast Renegade Republican and friend of the show, is joining us this morning. Nice to see you this morning, Dan.
Hey, good to be here. Nice to see you, too.
We've got a bombshell story this morning. I'm glad you're here because the Washington Post has yet another bombshell story, and the Russian connection, this time now with Jared Kushner, that person of interest, using unnamed government officials, as this new report states that President Trump is set to fight back using what he's building as a war room inside his administration to combat this Russia probe. At the heart of the story, Dan, is the idea that Jared Kushner was attempting to set up a secret back channel with the Russian ambassador in order to be able to have communications with the Russians outside of government's prying eyes. What do you make of this story?
Yeah, you know, when I ran for Congress, I bought a cricket phone, too, to set up a back channel with my campaign manager. I mean, is that a federal crime? You know, guys, listen. I'm generally a pretty happy warrior in this movement, contrary to my square jaw and generally mean looks. I am. I enjoy it. But this is really disturbing. Like, I was a former federal agent, and what we don't do in the federal government, I need your audience to understand, the federal government law enforcement Leviathan has a massive amount of power that until you're in it, you will never understand the hell they can bring down upon you if they want. That's why we don't target people. We target crimes and the people that do them later. If you want to find someone and you want to go after someone as a federal agent, you can make their lives miserable for ripping a tag off a mattress or claiming a $100 charitable deduction when they really gave $75. This is unbelievable. This is an evidence-free investigation that is simply determined to take down the President of the United States and his network. Mark my words, guys and ladies, this is going to be a stain on the nation. The history is going to look at this as a black eye moment and is going to be horrified at what happened at this investigation, if we can even call it that anymore.
Dan, I mean, the third paragraph of the New York Times, the failing New York Times this morning, it goes further by saying the idea was to have Flynn, then the National Security Advisor, or future one, speak directly to Moscow about Syria and other national security issues. And the back channel was never even set up. This is also something the Washington Post knew about since December. So why are we hearing about it at 7 p.m. the Friday before Memorial Day weekend?
Because, Steve, the Washington Post cares about two things and two things only. Make no mistake. Number one, clicks. They want your money. And number two, taking down the president. They don't care about an actual investigation. This is not the way this works. Yeah. The way it worked in Watergate is crime investigation. It doesn't work investigation and then let's go find the crime somewhere. This is absurd. A back channel? What does that even mean? Seriously, does it mean a cricket phone or something? It's ridiculous.
Well, they're getting their information somewhere. That's what I want to figure out, where these leaks are coming from, because it seems like every week it's the Friday night dump, some sort of big bombshell at like 5 p.m. that, you know, we don't know what the root of that is, where it's coming from, but I hope they figure it out soon. On another note, Dan, Hillary Clinton is back speaking at her alma mater, Wellesley, talking about impeachment. Take a listen to this part of it.
We were furious about the past presidential election of a man whose presidency would eventually end in disgrace with his impeachment for obstruction of justice.
Only problem, Nixon resigned before he was actually ever impeached.
Yeah, this is classic, but her husband was. That's kind of an interesting little historical tidbit, little curveball for you there. You know, it's amazing. She said in the speech it was a full-fledged assault on truth and reason, that's the time we live in now, where truth and reason seemingly don't matter. Yeah, keep in mind, guys, this is a woman whose campaign had to use bleach bit to erase the Truth and Reason on her email scandal. And this is a woman whose campaign crew took hammers to Blackberries to avoid Truth and Reason from actually being uncovered. And by the way, every step of her email scandal, she had a problem with Truth and Reason by actually answering questions honestly. She couldn't do it. Remember? I never sent or received classified information. Wrong. She was. Truth and Reason are the enemies of Hillary Clinton. They're like, you know, they're night and day. They've never married up and met, these two.
Well, and colluding with major networks to get debate questions ahead of time. I mean, all of these things emerged, you know.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you're going to be attending, but she's going to be teaching a new history class at Wellesley, so she's going to where she revises history.
Oh, really? Too bad that's always
revisionist
She'd fit right in.
Dan Bongino, good to have you with us this morning. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
All right, turning now to some other headlines this morning. A judge appointed by President Obama is dismissing a lawsuit against Hillary Clinton over the deaths of 2 Americans in Benghazi. Parents of Officer Sean Smith and CIA operative Tyrone Woods filing the wrongful death suit, saying that Clinton's private email server led to those attacks.
My understanding is they even sent an unarmed drone in there, and they were watching it happen, and they still didn't do anything. And by they, I mean Clinton.
The judge ruling Clinton's use of her private email was within the, quote, scope of her employment. 4 Americans total died on that day. And a professor verbally attacked by his own students over claims that he is racist.
I am not interested in debate. I am interested only in dialectic, which does mean I listen to you and you listen to me.
We don't care what terms you want to speak on.
Students the mobs at Evergreen State University, Washington State, demanding that he resign after he refused to take part in a day of absence event where all white people leave campus to provide a safe space for minorities. Well, that professor, Ben Weinstein, defending himself last night to Tucker Carlson. Take a look.
Bridges is answering a set of demands put forward by the protesters, and they have said that if he does not accept their demands, that there will be violence.
Well, the students will not be disciplined, but police have told Weinstein that he is not safe on campus. He's been forced to teach his course now at a public park. What? Wow. Well, everything we have been told about salt, it could be all wrong.
Leo, I see salt and pepper. Is there a salt substitute?
I'll get it.
Well, no need for that salt substitute anymore. That is because a top cardiovascular research scientist, we don't know his name, but he now says that eating too much salt will not kill you. In fact, he says too little will make you gain weight, reduce your sex drive, and increase the risk of diabetes. This is huge.
Salt. Rick has been waiting for this study for years now. Fantastic.
What about salt on French fries? More.
Is that even better? It's going to improve everything.
Makes you skinny.
I agree. Hey, guys, a lot going on in the weather today. Everybody wants to be outside Memorial Day. It's going to be a rough one. Take a look at the weather maps. Obviously, we're going to show you this race that's going on out here behind me as well. But here you go. Today, some severe weather. A very large chunk of the country, and especially where you see this red, that is worst threat. We're going to see some incredibly strong winds tonight. We'll see some very large hail, and we'll likely see some pretty big tornadoes today. Places like Tulsa and Joplin over towards Springfield. So be ready for that. The severe weather is going to go throughout the overnight hours as well. That becomes very dangerous when it's happening in the dark. Here's your forecast across the mid-Atlantic and towards the northeast Ohio Valley. Some clouds, a little bit of scattered showers across the southern side of this. Not as bad. And down across parts of the southeast Florida, unfortunately, you're remaining hot and dry again for the day. All right, guys. Here you go. Clayton, I know you're excited. This is...
Yeah, I can't wait to watch.
Yeah, this is what you're going to be doing later.
Hey, Rick, go do some activity out there.
Yeah, maybe.
Right,
we'll see.
We'll be
You bet.
All right, thanks, Rick. All right, disturbing new details emerging about the Manchester terrorists. Police believe he may have funded the attack with his student loans. Ryan Murrow here to break down the growing ties to terror next.
And we got a big show ahead. Corey Lewandowski, Lisa Booth, Taya Kyle, they're all here live. We've got a jam-packed 4 hours for you. Stay